It was revealed by serving sailors on board Britain's nuclear submarines that parts of the Trident submarine fleet are literally super glued together. Our aircraft carrier, which for a very long time had no aircraft upon it, has broken down all over the world. As I said, it broke down at the dock in Portsmouth, was towed out of the dock, started, then broke down again in the Isle of Wight. Some people saw it break down both times. The entire British Armed Forces could comfortably fit into Villa Park in Birmingham, not a particularly gigantic football stadium. I mean the Navy, the Air Force and the Army. But notwithstanding that this diminutive popinjay, this little Napoleon with none of Napoleon's military prowess, no Grande Armee, threatened both Russia and China in a single week. Even though he's the Prime Minister of a country that is virtually bankrupt, even though he's the Prime Minister of a country that cannot even defend its own food banks from the depredations of the county lines drug gangs, as somebody pointed out on Twitter just the other day. Even though he's the Prime Minister of a country where it's not safe to go out after dark in most of Britain's cities. Even though he's the Prime Minister of a country where people are running wild with machetes in high streets, in broad daylight. Even though he's the Prime Minister of a country, perhaps most notably at all, which cannot defend its own borders, but is determined to defend the borders of Taiwan. Even though, according to the British government and all but 13, now 12 governments in the entire world, Taiwan is part of China and therefore does not have any borders. But we are going to defend those non-existent borders. The mother of all talk shows next Wednesday will come from Beijing, and we'll deep dive, if you'll forgive the pun, into all of those issues there. Why am I talking about these three Anglo-Saxon, puerile, pathetic apologies for leaders? Well, that's because they were all together in the Osaka summit. And did you notice who was sitting in the front row for World War III? Yes, that's right. Victoria's Secret. Victoria Nuland, who turns up like Zelig, or perhaps like Satan himself, on the scene of every single zone of conflict in which the United States is involved. Under the careful, steely gaze of who ate all the pies, Victoria Nuland, these three, two of whom couldn't find the door if they didn't have aides to usher them out of it, and the other, if he stood up, you wouldn't be able to tell. They were there to announce their confrontation with China. They had traveled thousands of miles to China's region of the world to complain about China's aggression. They are getting ready to sail nuclear-powered submarines in Chinese waters around the area of Taiwan. They say that they will not be nuclear armed, but if you believe that, you'll believe anything. You probably believed Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell when they told you that Iraq was just bristling with weapons of mass destruction. I'll come back to Mr. Campbell in just a minute. These people threatening to confront China are already at war with Russia, even though their economies are sinking and their infrastructure is crumbling. Even though you cannot drink clean water in Flint, Michigan, or from the River Ohio, even though you can't safely get on a train in the United States of America. You certainly can't safely go over a bridge in the United States of America. They are devoting hundreds of billions of dollars, pounds and euros to confront China and Russia. As I say, next week we'll be in Beijing and we'll be deep diving into that subject. So let me turn to the other topics I want to talk about tonight. I have watched the slow motion murder of not one but two leaders of Pakistan. Back in the 1970s, as a young activist, I piloted through the city council of my hometown of Dundee a resolution demanding the saving of the life of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the legitimate leader of Pakistan, who was placed on trial by General Zia-ul-Haq and hanged by him, despite pleas for clemency from His Holiness the Pope, from the then King of Saudi Arabia, from civilized opinion throughout the Muslim world, and indeed more widely. I loved Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was, in my view, the greatest of all Pakistani leaders. He was a great world leader, a great leader of the non-aligned movement. In the 1970s, as a young activist, it broke my heart to read of how his daughter, Benazir Bhutto, still attending him as he was about to go to the gallows, giving him a last cigar to smoke, smelling the Shalimar eau de cologne of his cheek as she kissed him for the last time. And then, after herself being imprisoned, I received Benazir Bhutto at the airport in London, stick thin, blood still coming from her ears from injuries sustained in the jail. And I stood by her side for 3 decades. And I watched her twice being overthrown by the very people now overthrowing Imran Khan and now threatening to put him to death. I spoke to Benazir Bhutto. May God preserve her and keep her memory alive forever. On the eve of her departure from Dubai, on her ill-fated journey back to Pakistan, I watched her slow motion truck ride on top of a plinth, on top of an open-top bus, an open-top truck. I watched the millions in Pakistan come out to throw flowers at her, and I knew that very soon it would not be flowers that they were throwing at her. And now I'm watching the slow motion attempted murder of a third popular leader of Pakistan. Outside Imran Khan's house right now, this instant, there are tens of thousands of protesters seeking to protect him from an ever more ferocious assault. First gas, now guns, firing live ammunition outside the house of the legitimate Prime Minister of the country. They say they want to take him to prison to face up to 80 charges, up to and including the allegation of murder. I've been in this play before. I've seen this playbook before. If Imran Khan is taken from Zaman Park and placed behind bars, you will never see his face again. Because if you think about it, how could they allow you to? A man so popular that they cannot possibly face him in a parliamentary election, not just because he would beat them, but because he would so sweep the boards, he could put every single one of them on trial for sedition. He could change the constitution of a ramshackle republic that bitterly, deeply, profoundly needs changing. They cannot allow Imran Khan to live. And so if he is snatched by those body snatchers outside his home right now, As sure as eggs is eggs, he will be murdered, because the usurpers can do nothing else. In Shakespeare's words, they are steeped in blood so far. Is it bloodier to go on or to go our? And so I say to his former brother-in-law, Lord Goldsmith, in the British Foreign Office, I say to his former friend, Boris Johnson, the erstwhile Prime Minister of Britain, I say to the Chancellor of Oxford University, whose distinguished alumni he is, I say to the entire foreign policy establishment in London and in Washington, you better save the life of Imran Khan, not just because this noble and brave man deserves to be saved, but because Pakistan will become completely uncontrollable if Imran Khan is murdered by the crime gang, the crime bosses that you have placed in power in his stead. 300 millions of the Pakistanis and tens, scores of millions of Pakistanis around the world will be uncontrollable if their leader is murdered. And Pakistan's in a very strategic place. If you need me to remind you, it borders with Iran, it borders with China, it borders with Afghanistan, it borders with India. Do I need to remind you that 300 million uncontrollable people live in a country that has an entire flight of nuclear weapons? If you do not want Pakistan to disappear into an unfathomable vortex of violence, you'd better tell your puppet regime in Islamabad to take their hands off Imran Khan, for if they harm one hair on the head of Imran Khan, they, not the usurpers, not the puppets, but the puppet masters, not the monkeys, but the organ grinders, will be responsible for what happens next. Now, on Sunday, I'll go into more depth about the 20th anniversary of the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Because, of course, I'm in a good position, a good vantage point to talk to you about how all that went. I was one of the top leaders of the great movement against the war in Britain. I marched at the front of the great demonstrations of millions of people in Britain to try and stop the war, though the Stop the War organization has now airbrushed me from their history. Everyone who was around at the time, including Andrew Murray, the now president, who frequently stated that along with the late Mr. Benn, I was the most popular of all the speakers at all those demonstrations. You won't hear him or them say that now, but they cannot airbrush me from the history of that great movement against the war. Incidentally, Imran Khan spoke with me in Hyde Park on such a platform. I have only time to say one thing, and it is a significant thing. I saw today the laughing hyena, the jackal, Alastair Campbell, the Goebbels to Tony Blair, who lied us into the invasion and through the occupation of Iraq. I saw him laughing again in the launch of a podcast on the Iraq war. The man who lied us into the Iraq war is now making hay in a podcast, I may say, jointly produced with Gary Lineker. The two of them work closely together on a podcast which inexplicably appears to have a very large number of followers, which just goes to show that crime does pay. Because Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair have become as rich as Croesus out of the great war crime. Now, it has become de rigueur to describe the invasion and occupation of Iraq as a blunder. Although Campbell won't even do that. I saw that David Frum, with whom I used to regularly tangle in the media 20 years ago, said, and I quote, that the invasion of Iraq was a blunder is becoming more clear with every passing anniversary, with every passing year. That the invasion of Iraq was a blunder is more clear, says Mr. Frum. I told him that at the time. I warned him that at the time. But David Frum is prospering too, like Mr. Blair and like Mr. Campbell. And one of the lessons that we need to learn and haven't learned, because the same people that talked you into the war in Iraq are trying to talk you into a war with China, with Russia, with Iran, with anybody that the empire stumbles upon as they spin the bottle to see who will be next. My first guest this evening is from one of the places at which the bottle might rest. He's Professor Syed Mohammed Marandi, and he's coming up right now. Stay tuned.